What's up, YouTube? Welcome back to your daily dose of Diablo. My name is Mr. Llama, and in today's video, we are going to be talking about poison damage. Poison damage is quite complicated. It is actually way more complicated, I would say, than you might initially think. A lot of people are just like, you just add it all together and do this. And there are cases where it gets added together, cases where just the length gets added together and the other parts don't. There's a lot, right? And a lot of just exceptions to all of it. So let's first talk a little bit about poison damage and what it is. So poison damage is essentially like a negative life regeneration. That's kind of a really good way to think about it. And this is useful later down the line as well. Multiple poison attacks do not stack. So when you hit a monster with poison damage, they will take damage over time. So it is a damage for X frames, essentially. And the damage is actually split into units right here. I can actually go and go to this slide first. So 256 are the units of damage. It's like a broken down further piece of damage. And frames are broken down. 1 second is 25 frames, right? That's the base of Diablo 2. So for instance, a toxic small charm, which is 100 poison damage over 5 seconds, is 205 out of 256 poison damage. That is the damage units that you will need to use for your calculations for 125 frames. This is 125 times 205 divided by 256 over 125 divided by 25, excuse me, not 5. Let me put that there. 25 seconds, right? And that'll give you 100 poison damage over 5 seconds. So that is how the damage of that charm actually calculates out. And I think it's actually like 100.8 or whatever, but everything gets rounded down. These are not perfect units for getting like integers out of it. So in Diablo 2, when you run into that, it just truncates off the decimal, rounds it down to the nearest integer right there. So this is how it is calculating and what the back end, I guess, of poison damage is actually going to be, right? So again, you take that poison damage and you hit, and then you hit, and then I hit, and multiple people are hitting with poison, and a monster's already poisoned, and then somebody else hits with poison. What happens? It is this. It either overwrites and then begins the new poison, or it applies the poison damage for 1 frame. And this is based on if the new poison is equal to or stronger than the poison that's currently existing. So if I keep hitting somebody with the same poison damage over and over again, that's equal to, all I'm doing is resetting the length to whatever it is from the start of when I did that latest hit further on. If you come in and hit with a stronger poison, your poison will then overwrite, and then it will give it the new length based on your poison, the new damage and length based on your poison. So there's just 1 poison active at a time. And again, all other poisons will only be dealt at 1 frame, which means having multiple poisons in a party is kind of garbage, because it's always just going to be the strongest poison that's doing the damage. And then any other poison is just not going to, right? It's just going to hit for a single frame and then it'll fail out. So that's one thing to know. Additionally, if you're in a party and using poison, the poison probably sucks. And this is because online versus offline, there is a big difference in the game in how life regen works, or again, like I said before, negative regen. So essentially, there is the first frame that you do damage in both online and offline, regen stops. This means, poison or life regen for a mob, right? Think of Ubers. Ubers always have their life regenning like crazy, but if you hit them on that exact frame you hit them, their life regen stops. Then it starts up again. Online, there is an additional 7 frames where they do not have any life regen. So what this means is online, there's actually certain Uber builds that can kill Ubers online, but can't kill it offline, because online you're actually able to hit and kill because you're able to stop that regen, since you only have to do damage once every 7 frames or 8 frames to keep their life regen at bay. Whereas offline, you would have to be hitting every single frame to stop them from regenning, right? So there are certain builds that do fail on an offline. And we can actually go over here to Pavkey's post. Of course, it's Pavkey, who has a really good write-up. I will link all of this down below so you can go read through because it's very interesting. But this gives you a good sense of how it all works. Now, why does it suck for poison? Because like I said, poison is like a negative regen, right? Pavkey says it as well. And so what actually happens is doing any damage every 8 frames completely stops friendly poison damage. And it's not just from you or from your minions. It is from anybody in your party. So if any person in your party is hitting a monster, your poison damage is not working. And this again is once every 8 frames, which is a third of a second. So people are going to be hitting mobs very often. Your poison damage is going to be pretty useless. This is also why a lot of people say do not run skeletons, especially online, with poison. Offline, again, it's just that single frame that they're hitting that it's actually stopping it. So yeah, that can, if you have like, 15 skeletons or 12 skeletons, let's say, and a golem, and they're all hitting all over the place while you're using Poison Nova, they are actually going to be slowing you down an okay amount because that's a lot of frames, right? Every time they swing for each multiplied, for every mob you have, that's kind of a lot that you are stopping right there. But online, it's 8 frames per hit per one of those skeletons. So online, you basically get no poison damage if you have a Skelly army with your Poison Nova as well. So this is kind of the conclusion, right? He has with all of that. Online doing any damage at the rate of 8 frames per second will fully stop friendly poison damage. It's garbage. It's garbage. It's just complete garbage. But I want to go back because we haven't really explained poison damage overall. We've talked a little about online, offline, and all of this, and blah, blah, blah. And we talked about, stacking and whatnot. But I want to dive further into this calculation right here because it goes a lot deeper than this. Because this is very simple. This is, I have a single toxic small charm, and I am hitting with the single source of poison damage. But the real question is, what happens if there's multiple sources? What happens if I have a toxic small charm of Anthrax and it has multiple poison mods on it, right? For instance, your 313 damage over 11 seconds. How does that function? What happens if I have a toxic small charm of Anthrax and then I also have a perfect emerald socketed in my weapon and my weapon has its own poison source as well, right? There's so many combinations and complications for all this stuff, and we are going to dive into that right now. So Amazon Basin is a good source for everything. This is really where you should be looking for all of your really detailed Diablo 2 needs. It is the most accurate site of all sites, and they have these tables which are fantastic. So the first one talks about just having a single item, right? Remember, there are prefixes and suffixes. We did the affix talk recently. Prefixes and suffixes on an item. So a toxic small charm adds poison damage, and a small charm of Anthrax adds poison damage. Get them both on the same charm, you get a toxic small charm of Anthrax, you get poison damage on the front end and back end. So again, if it's a single one, you just add them together, the rates and lengths. So 100 damage plus 50 damage equals 313 damage? Hold on, I thought you said add them together. I did. You have to remember, you have to add it over on the frame rate. 205 out of 256, whatever, plus 86 out of 256 is 291, right? So you have to add the frames together. It is a damage of 291, 256 damage, and then the frames get added together for the lengths. So this is 275 frames. And when you do the calculation and that math, it will come out to 313 damage, right? This is just the base when you do, let's see, 125 times 205 over 256. So again, if we get a calculator and we do 291 times 125 grams. Sorry. 275 times 291 divided by 256 equals 312.5. That's very interesting. I would assume that would round to 312 and not 13. Very confused on that. Did I do the math wrong? 275 times 291? No. Is it because I didn't do it separately? 275 times 291 divided by 256? I don't know. It doesn't even make sense. And that's not how math works. But regardless, that is where you get your 313 number. Why it is rounding up instead of down, I can't explain to you in this video. I'll have to look at that later. Or someone in the comments can tell me why it's rounding up there or what I missed. So that is how you actually get 313. And then, of course, for seconds, it is just 5 and 6 and 11, or 125 frames, 150, 275 divided by 25 is 11. And that is going to be the damage per second, or total damage and then total seconds right there. Because you have to remember, this is 100 damage over 5 seconds and 50 damage over 6 seconds. So it would only make sense that if you're doubling this right here to 11 seconds, that these damages aren't going to be 150 over, but you would actually get much more damage, right? So it makes sense when you think about it that way. Now, what happens? Its damage is rounded to the nearest point, although it should always be rounded down. When multiple items applying poison damage are equipped, then the rates are added and the lengths are averaged. It says it should always be rounded down, but I guess in some cases it isn't. So let's talk about that second example. We now have our toxic small charm of anthrax, which we know how we got to that. We also have Black Bog Sharp, which is 488 damage over 10 seconds, and a Perfect Emerald, which is 100 damage over 7.16 seconds. Now, it's also really important to note that every single gem, jewel, and rune all counts as a separate item within, even if they're socketed within the same item. So if you're putting a Tau rune and a Perfect Emerald and another Perfect Emerald and all that, each one of those count as a separate item when you are doing this calculation. Just something good to note. Anyways, beyond this, let's take a look at this math. So when you have multiple sources, the rates are added and the lengths are averaged. So this is actually where it changes. On the same item, you're adding both together. On different items and different sources of poison right here, you're actually adding the sums. So 291 plus 500 plus 143 is 934. And you are adding the frames and then averaging the frames right there to get 234 times 934 divided by 256 poison damage over 9.36 seconds, which is the sum of the frames divided by 3 and then divided by 25. Okay? So this is where you are getting your damage. And again, if we bring in our calculator, 234 times 934 divided by 256. Oops, I missed 234 times 934 divided by 256. We get 853, and there it does round down. So that is where you get the 853 damage over 9.36 seconds. So this is going to be your calculation right there, right? Again, averages of lengths, but sums of the damage types. This just helps so you don't get this like infinitely long length, right? Because you could just think about, 704 divided by 25, that's 28 seconds. Having an item that has 10 seconds, 11 seconds, I guess you could just add these three together, and 7 seconds. If like you had 9 sources of poison damage and all of a sudden it was making your poison damage take like 2 minutes to go through, that would be miserable, right? So this instead averages this together for the length, and thus as you're adding in poison damage, you are going to be just increasing the damage that you're doing, essentially. Now, there is a slightly different calculation when multiple items apply poison damage are used with skills that apply less than 100% weapon damage. So if you're using multi-shot, strafe, blade sentinel, blade fury, or blade sentinel and blade fury with two-handed weapons, it is sum of lengths divided by sources -1, and the poison length for the blade sentinel and blade fury is going to be sum of lengths. So this actually will be a really long poison time if you're using blade sentinel and or blade fury, which does actually kind of feel a little bit better because that is kind of your like range shot, right? You're not sitting there, and so you're kind of like hitting a bunch of mobs, but that still could be very long lengths just to have, right? So something to note for these few skills. Now, let's dive a little bit deeper because there is more to it. So skills. When the skill level is set when the player uses a skill, adding and removing skill bonuses when have blah, 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 blah. While skills are normally treated as separate sources of poison damage, whose rates compete with those of other skills and items, Poison Dagger and the Javelins, but not the Cloud, so just the Javelin as it hits, of Poison Jab and Plague Jab, combine skill damage rate with any item rates added to the attack damage. The length for which this combined rate is applied is calculated by summing item skill and item lengths and dividing by the number of items. So let's say we have that exact same setup, but we also have level 30 Poison Dagger. Well, this means we're going to have 13,944 to 14,482 damage over 13.92 seconds. And this is just going to be, again, 1044 right over there for our length, divided by 4, and then divided by 25 is 10.44. Wait, what? Oh, sorry. Divided by 3, not 4. 1,044 divided by 3, and then divided by 25. And again, for your poison right here, you have 348, which is 1,044 divided by 3. So once you have that length there in frames, times 10,654, which is the sum of all of the damages. So it still is, again, summing up all of these, and then dividing by 256. So again, you get 14,482 damage over 13.92 seconds. If the only item used was Black Bog Sharp, so if you remove this Toxic Small Charm and the Perfect Emerald, you would actually have 22,000 to 23,000 damage over 23.6 seconds, right? So you have to note that by adding in a Toxic Small Charm of Anthrax and a Perfect Emerald, you're actually reducing the amount of damage that you're doing by about 10,000, right? 9 to 10,000 less. However, you have to consider the overtime, right? That is the big important piece. This is 14,000 over 13 seconds. This is 23,000 over 23 seconds. So you have to consider that adding these in is going to be reducing this, which is actually increasing your dot, but decreasing the total damage that you do. And this is where you can do some of these calculations on your own, and you can start deciding, do I want to add a bunch of poison sources in? So then when I do a stab of my Poison Dagger, yes, I'm only doing like 5,000 damage, but it's over 2 seconds or whatever, and so it ticks a lot faster. And then if I just stab a few more times, right? You can decide what you want, because if we're going to be honest, a lot of times you don't need 23,000 poison damage over 23 seconds. You know, that can just take a little bit too long. It might be more beneficial to have 14,000 over 13.92 seconds. Now, maybe not. Maybe you want to stab once and run on, and you do need this high amount. That's something that, again, will all have to be calculated by you as you go along and all this stuff. But just something that is good to note. And again, this is specific for Poison Dagger, Poison Jab, and Plague Jab, right? That have these very specific pieces. Now, there is one more thing to really talk about, and that is Venom. Venom gets talked about often as something you do not want to actually have. And this is because it can actually be a ruiner of your damage, since its frame length overrides that of any items. So let's take a look. we have this same exact setup, which again, if we go up to that same setup before, you know, all the way up at the top right there, we were getting 853 damage over 9.36 seconds. Great. Now we come in and we add in Venom, which will go right here. We add in Venom, and all of a sudden you add tons of damage, like tons and tons of damage, but your frames are 10 frames. And this is it. All the other frames get nullified. So you only do 361 damage over 0.4 seconds. So it is nice in that you get quick burst damage out there, as opposed to having to wait the 9 seconds or whatever for it. But it also means you're going to have a lot of time where they're not poisoned, right? Unless you're literally hitting each of these mobs, whatever, every 0.4 seconds, they're not going to be poisoned in there. So all this extra damage, can start to really wind down because, again, you just have such a short frame length. So Venom is sometimes to be avoided if you actually want to poison the individual in PvP or PvE, whatever it is, for longer than 0.4 seconds, right? If you do that, it's just a quick, and then they're not really poisoned. So it's more just like hitting for a damage in general, which, that's not that much damage to really have hit. So it's a little bit sad, that Venom does that. However, there is the case where Venom is really great, and this is Poison Dagger, Poison Jab, and Plague Jab. Again, not for the clouds, for the actual hits of those. Casting Venom does not override the skill. So you can have Poison Dagger, you can have your 340 frames from Poison Dagger, you can have your Venom and your 10 frames there, and now you get 350 frames or 14 seconds, and then you can have 25,941 damage over 14 seconds. So this has like doubled our poison damage, or this is more of the poison damage than we had before for about half the time by adding in a level 15 Venom right there. So Venom can actually be really nice with Poison Dagger. And this is where you can get Venom from Andariels. You can get it from Arachnid Mesh. There's the charges. On Treachery and Grief, there's Venom. There's a couple other like sources of Venom out there. Some on proc, some are charges, whatever. But you can use these. I think Dragon has Venom on it, if I'm not mistaken. So there's a couple other sources and ways that you can get it, where if you did mix that with your Poison Dagger, you could actually do a ton of poison damage there. But overall, this is why a lot of people, in general, with the exception of Poison Dagger, and nobody really does it really much with Poison Jab and Plague Jab, a lot of people talk about don't really use Venom if you want to have poison damage actually like doing negative life regen on them, right? And like keeping them poisoned and stuff, because Venom will just come in and kind of wreck you on that. Again, if you just want to hit for a lot of damage and have your poison just be really quick, then you can just add Venom in. If you're not really doing like poison as a source, you just kind of want to have Venom with your character, then great. Now I just do a quick poison damage for for 10 frames. And this can be great for just kicking or whatever it is that you want, just to add some extra damage in really quickly. But poison isn't like my main source of damage or something I'm trying to like really stack up on in any other way. Because again, if I am, then these toxic small charms of Anthrax and all this stuff are just going to be like completely worthless, as it's just really not going to do very much. Venom is kind of takes over and just kind of becomes your source. So that pretty much is your summary there. There's a lot of information. I'll link this down below to kind of give you the overall sense. But this talks about your lengths and frames. This talks about summing together prefixes and suffixes on an item. Gems, jewels, runes count all separate, even if socketed in a single item. Item and Venom rates are only added to the skill rates of Poison Dagger and Javelins. I didn't talk about this, but poison plus % poison damage isn't applied to item and venom rates when applied by ranged attacks. That's just one small thing. So it's just for melee attacks there. And then the length being calculated a little differently for those. But the really big, mostly important thing that you're going to be dealing with is going to be this. You're going to be getting all of your sums of your damage and then your averages of your lengths, with the exception of venom, or of course the like prefix suffix on the same item, but you're not really like looking at that. You'll just be looking at a toxic small charm of anthrax and just knowing that it's 291 over 11, right? Or 313 over 11, or 291 frames, whatever. And you can just carry that forward to your calculation. So I would say this is really going to be your big calculation to get a sense of where your poison damage is going to be. And remember, this is poison damage that's going to be applied to, you know, your melee attacks or whatever it is. This is not like my poison nova, right? Like adding small charm of anthrax does not increase my poison nova damage. Having a perfect emerald does not increase my poison nova damage. Anything like that, it's not increasing. This is applying to a physical attack the poison damage that is coming from that piece. Again, if you have like poison dagger where you're physically stabbing them, then that's different. But otherwise, just general like poison skills, these sorts of things aren't applying. So I hope that gave you a little bit more understanding of poison damage overall. That'll do it for today. If you have questions, comments, feel free to post them down in the chat below. If there's future episodes you'd love to see, future things you want explained, you can just post there and let me know. Otherwise, don't forget to like and subscribe, YouTube. Peace, everybody.